This week, you may have seen a New York Times article that made its way around various corners of the internet entitled Bad Art Friend. How many of you have seen this one? Okay, a handful of you. The article describes a drama between two writers arguing over who owns a story, what constitutes a friendship, and among other things, how to settle a conflict. If you haven't yet read this story, essentially one writer wrote a story, and a colleague of hers felt like the story was stolen from her own personal experience. A protracted legal battle royale ensued, and the years-long back and forth between them makes for a fascinating long-form piece. And as I read the article, wondering which side might have been more right, I came away from it feeling like each of the writers were missing something. In their arguing, focused as they were on winning, each of them end up losing their humanity a little bit. They lose their sense of the other and why they got into the disagreement in the first place. Each side was fueled by a desire to win or to prove something or to be the best. Now, many of us, I'm sure, relate to this. Even if we aren't feuding with a colleague, many of us want to be the best or prove that we are something good. And it's usually more fun to win than to lose. But it's only worth it if you retain some sense of humanity. And in Parshat Noach, which we read this week, we have plenty of reasons to consider humanity itself, both in the sense of Noah literally saving the human race after the great flood here at the beginning of Genesis, and in the sense of the humanness that Noah exemplifies. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav. Noah was the most righteous man of his generation. Considering that the rest of Noah's generation was so sinful that God chose to destroy them all, this is kind of a backhanded compliment, like being named the most valuable player in the B'nai B'rith basketball league. Thanks for that one. In the Midrash Tanhuma, Rabbi Hanina says something similar. This is like being a jar of wine in a cellar filled with vinegar, which is perhaps a little bit nicer, but you get the idea. It's just not that much of an accomplishment. This phrasing leads to one of the more famous debates of ancient Jewish exegesis. In the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan argues that if Noah were in a different generation, he wouldn't have been considered righteous at all. Next to giants like Abraham or Moses, he was garnished. But on the flip side, Reish Lakish argues in the Talmud that Noah was all the more righteous because of the opportunities that he had in his generation to sin. It's much harder to be good, Reish Lakish argues, when the world around you makes it so easy and cool to be bad. So which is it? Was he a paragon of righteousness or really nothing so special? To be honest, I'm not so convinced it's either, or maybe it's both. Maybe being nothing special is a way of being righteous. This is a lesson that all of us probably need to hear every so often, and if either litigant in the legal battle between the writers had been willing to concede this point, it may have saved them some money and some emotional pain, continuing to grapple over who is right. Returning to Noah for a moment, what do we actually know about him? The Torah is clear that Noah does what he's supposed to. He doesn't come up with some ingenious plan of his own. God tells him how to ensure the future of humans and animals alike, and he does what he is told. He's not an innovator, really. But that's just fine for God's purposes. And compared to his neighbors, who innovate all manner of idol worship, the fact that he's cool with the same old one invisible God is exactly what Noah does right. In these cases, then, the fact that Noah is simply adequate is what makes him special. As Hillel says in Pirkei Avot, in a place where there are no people, be a person. And this is where Noah's success lies. There's something dark, though, in that dictum. Noah soon found himself quite literally in a place where there were no people, and he had to figure it out what it meant to be one. At the climax of the flood, the text pivots and gives us a somber, if ultimately hopeful, image of the world at that moment. Vayimach et kol hayakum, all existence on earth, was blotted out. Humans, cattle, creeping things, and birds of the sky. Vayishe'er ach Noach, and only Noah remained. On the one hand, this is a necessary bit of exposition to get the story moving along. The flood killed everyone else, and only Noah and his family survived. But Rashi points out that this phrasing, Vayishe'er ach Noach, could also be translated as Noah only survived, or Noah barely survived. He was alive post-flood, but he was worn out. A rabbinic story found in numerous midrashim teaches that during the 12 months that Noah was on the ark, Noah never slept. After saving each species from destruction, he spent his time on the ark tending to them, giving them food and water, and managing to supply them with exactly the food that every individual species needed. One day on the ark, he was late to feed one of the lions, and he bit him, which left Noah with a number of physical ailments. And so, the Midrash teaches, pointing to the phrase, Vayishe'er ach Noach, Noah survived the flood, but only barely. He did what he had to do, and he got through it, and he worked really, really hard, and it all made him tired. And this, I think, truthfully, is what made him a tzaddik. Not the fact that he built an ark and gathered all the animals, but just the fact that he survived. His role wasn't to be great like Abraham or Moses. It was just to be alive, to survive, to be a person. And sometimes being a person is really all it takes. When we think back to the story of Noah's Ark that we learn as kids, we might remember only the ark, or perhaps the flood and all of the animals 2 by 2. And if that's what we're thinking of, we end up thinking that he's one of our biblical heroes. And therefore, we might not understand why the rabbis are so quick to condemn him as only sort of righteous. But at the end of the story, once Noah is back on dry land, we read the unfortunate conclusion of the Noah narrative. He plants some grapevines, makes wine, gets blackout drunk, and takes off all his clothes in front of his children. This, though we don't tell that to our children, typically is why our sages question whether or not Noah was really all that great. But I think that episode makes him all the more a tzaddik. Maybe not the nudity part, lahavdil. It doesn't take much to understand why Noah might have wanted to get a little bit drunk that day. He was tired, sure, but he also had endured the trauma of watching everyone he knew die in a flood. His story is the first of many Jewish stories that remind us that survival is good, of course, but it can sometimes be painful. And if surviving and living is part of being human, so is acknowledging the pain of it all and all that can be lost. Noah wanted to escape a little pain, which is perhaps the most human thing that he ever does. By failing in this way, the story presents him even more colorfully as the paradigmatic human. By being human, really human, he becomes a tzaddik, a righteous person. Perhaps instead of innovating, instead of trying to be heroic or the best or right about something, humbly being human is really what matters when it comes to living a righteous life. This may not make for thrilling journalism, but it is an essential lesson, and perhaps an especially useful one these days in late pandemic life, as we all renegotiate the terms of what it means to be good or successful. When it comes to the writers in that Times article I mentioned before, I'll let you all decide after services when you debate which side is right, if either of them is at all. But at the very least, we can say that we lose something when we focus only on being right, or being the best, or proving ourselves. It may be better instead to be satisfied simply by being alive. And maybe it's when we are our most human, allowing ourselves to accept the humanness of others as well, that we can really live a life of righteousness. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.